Welcome to Connecting the Dots, a laser-focused quick-fire interview on food and the economy with international experts where we seek answers to questions we should all be asking. I'm Ajay Jakar, Chairman Bharat Krishik Samaj of Farmers Forum India, as well as Vice Chair of Action Track to Shift to Sustainable Consumption Patterns at the UN Food Systems Summit. We are delighted today to have Professor Jayati Ghosh, Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, USA. Thank you, Professor Ghosh, for joining us today.
Thank you, Ajay. It's a pleasure.
We'll jump straight into the questions. In the recent years, we've seen Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Michael Bloomberg, George Soros have paid no federal income tax, or people like Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Rupert Murdoch, Mark Zuckerberg have paid anywhere from 1 to 3% of their income as taxes. The situation is no different in India. The pandemic has made it impossible for the world to ignore the growing wealth and income disparities that characterize capitalist economies. Do you think the concentration of wealth in few hands is inevitable, or can it be countered with effective policy measures? Something like a billionaire's tax.
I think there's no question that it can be countered. And the reason we can see that is because different countries have very different levels of wealth of billionaires and of shares of income. So if you look at the Scandinavian countries or even some developing countries, you find that there isn't the same kind of extreme tax avoidance, and there isn't that kind of extreme wealth and income inequality. It is possible. We can create laws that do not have the loopholes that these billionaires are able to utilize, and we can have systems that force multinationals to pay their fair share as well.
Just yesterday, I read India's richest company, Reliance Industries, in its last financial year, earned a profit of 55,000 crore rupees. That's nearly $10 billion, I think. But paid an effective tax of 3%, like its peers in the world. The recent corporate tax reform by the G7, coming after the European Commission and Biden administration's push for a minimum corporate tax, have been hailed as an historic move. However, you have argued that the proposal settles for a lowered minimum tax rate of 15% and does not take into account the losses in tax revenue for developing countries. What would you suggest, and how would it account for developing countries who often intentionally keep tax rates low to encourage investments?
I think we have been arguing, some of us in an independent commission for the reform of international corporate taxation have been arguing for some years now that we really need to have a system of unitary taxation. That is, a multinational corporation is one company and behaves like one company globally. But Apple India is different from Apple France, it's different from Apple US, and therefore they can use this system of shifting their profits around different jurisdictions so that they pay the minimum tax. And presumably Reliance is doing something similar. Along with taking advantage of various loopholes in the Indian tax system, it is actually shifting profits to other jurisdictions like Mauritius, Seychelles, I'm not sure where. This is called aggressive tax planning. And this is possible because our legal tax systems allow it. Now, if we have a global agreement that we will all the countries will tax a corporation according to this country's share of the profits according to sales and employment, then there will be no incentive to move the profits around. And so that's one very important means. Of course, for that, it's best to have a single minimum tax rate. And it has to be a reasonably high rate. We had suggested 25%, which is the average of tax rates across the world. The United States had earlier suggested 21%. Biden himself had suggested 21%. Now it has come down to only 15%, which is ridiculous. That is the same as the tax rates of havens like Ireland and the Netherlands. So it will not help us at all. Now in India, we have a tax rate of 24%. If you have a global minimum of 15%, that minimum becomes the maximum effectively, because companies will shift their profits around to the country with the minimum rate. So this will actually cause us to lose even more tax revenue rather than gain. And we should actually oppose this completely and say we will not accept such a low minimum tax rate.
Now that we're discussing India, we see that the GDP growth is falling. Inflation is still high for essential commodities like edible oils, pulses, due to the rise in government taxes on fuel and global commodity prices. Even poor and middle class households are now cutting down on food expenditure. Are we in a situation of stagflation? How should the government handle this situation, and what would be the consequences if it fails to do so?
It's not stagflation because there's nothing within the economy that is generating inflation other than the government's policies. So this is, as you mentioned yourself, this inflation in India today is completely the result of these higher and higher taxes on fuel. The government is trying to exploit the people by putting the burden of payment on the poor. And it is trying to get more and more revenues from ordinary people, but through these very regressive tax systems, which are generating inflation, of course. It need not do that. Yes, last year we had record profits in the Indian corporate sector, and yet taxes from profits fell. We got less taxes from profits. What is going on? So we have a government that is taxing the corporates even less as their profits double in some cases and for some corporates. And yet they're putting the entire burden of raising revenues on the poor, while they are not providing the basic services that we need during the pandemic. So what do we do about it? The answer is very simple. Reduce these terrible, extremely unequalizing and extremely unfair taxes on fuel.
That's a good point. As farmers organization, we are also feeling the pinch of, when we use a tractor or when we transport
exactly.
It's a problem. And it adds to cost that consumers ultimately pay.
And this is a distributive choice made by the government. This is not something inevitable. It's not the global prices. It's not. This is entirely the government of India's decision.
Which comes to the next question is, you have written about over-reliance of governments across the world on monetary rather than physical policy to overcome economic downturns. We see this concern reflected in India as well, where economists such as yourself and Raghuram Rajan have recommended stimulating the economy by putting money into the hands of the people. In the years since the first wave of the pandemic, the governments have been reluctant to heed this advice. If so, why? And what are the long-term consequences of not putting money into the hands of the people for the Indian economy?
This is one of the areas where I think there's really a global consensus almost, except in India, that governments have to spend more. Because right now, households have been extremely damaged, and more so in India because we've given no social protection over this period. So households are reeling, they are impoverished, they are unable to spend more. Because there's no demand from households, investors are not willing to spend more. Why would you invest to increase production when there's no demand? The market is shrinking. So the only agency that can improve the economy, that can reverse this downward trend, is the government. Macroeconomically, the government has to spend. And this is not just me. This is the IMF saying that. This is every OECD saying that. Everybody is saying governments have to spend. The government of India has to spend. Now, unlike many other developing countries, we don't have an external debt problem. We don't even have a large current account deficit at the moment. We don't have the kinds of difficulties that other developing countries have, which make them less willing to spend. So in our case, it's entirely the result of some very weird sort of leftover straitjacket. It's no longer relevant. All those arguments for fiscal austerity, everybody else in the world has dumped them except us. So I think we urgently need to spend more if the economy is to revive. The government has to spend more. And it must spend, first of all, to provide relief to the people, to ensure food, to ensure proper procurement prices, to ensure minimum income. Let's say for 6 months, you provide a minimum basic income as compensation for the livelihood you have denied people. You spend double of what you're spending on health, expend more on education. These are obvious. These are things everywhere else governments are doing. And so it's not that this is something very unusual or remarkable. If we don't do these, there's an immediate consequence that we will continue in a downward spiral for the economy. And there's a medium-term consequence that we will have actually continued decline in health, in education, in productivity of our workers. And then there is a longer-term concern that we could actually have a lost generation in terms of employment.
There is as a farmer organization trying to work on advocacy now with the UN Food System Summit and other places, I find something that has been very clearly articulated by Professor Devesh Kapoor and economists like Arvind Subramaniam, where they say that there is lack of representation and equity in research, and it's a widespread problem. A mere 7% of those authoring papers of the World Bank's prestigious annual bank conference on development economics are from the developing world. Similarly, while funding from individual donors and philanthropists pour into the developing world to influence national food policies, hardly anyone stops to consider the motives that are driving the donors and whatever they are aligning their interests to. So, is this an unconscious bias, or do you think this is deliberate? So I'm trying to figure out two different parts. One is of money that's funding research, and also about philanthropists, large philanthropists driving policy and research towards a particular point.
I have huge concerns about both. I think, first of all, let's leave the money part out of it. There is a significant hierarchy in social sciences and in economics in particular. You've already highlighted that, where the North Atlantic, the US and the UK basically dominate in research, in giving the agenda for pedagogy and teaching, in deciding who are good economists, in determining who will get jobs that are valued, and who will even advise governments across the world. It's all decided in the North Atlantic. So there is a big regional bias already, and it is basically a kind of colonial bias, I would say. But in addition to that, there is the increasing corporatization of education and research, which is actually terrifying, because we all know this, that there can be massive conflicts of interest, especially in research that impacts directly on the possibilities of profitability of corporations. So if you have large corporations funding research, which directly or indirectly can affect their bottom line, that's a very, very concerning thing. Major agribusiness getting into funding research that is relevant for agriculture, I would say that's a no-no. And yet that is now the dominant phenomenon. It's a bit like pharma companies funding research to show that their products are the best. Very, very strong conflicts of interest, and yet it's widespread. The philanthropy, unfortunately, shows the same conflicts of interest. I'm very disturbed by the rise of these big foundations that are increasingly interventionist and in terms of policy, and not even in a very broad sense, in a very specific sense. If you look at the Gates Foundation, for example, it's intervening significantly in all kinds of issues like patents, and intellectual property rights during the pandemic, trying to protect those, ensuring a very market-oriented approach to vaccine distribution. All of this directly impacts companies of which Mr. Gates himself is a shareholder. These would not be allowed within any national system, but because they're global and because they're so large, therefore, in fact, you get this kind of thing accepted. Now, I personally believe that instead of philanthropy, all of these companies and all of these very rich people should just pay their taxes, not put all their energy into the avoidance measures that you've talked about, so that they never pay any taxes at all for years on end, whereas the median tax rate on income is 30%. They don't pay anything, they pay zero. Don't do all the philanthropy, don't do all the giving and so on. Just pay your taxes as companies, as individuals.
Which gets me to the last question. And I ask this question because when you look at the employment rate in India, employment is at record high levels. If you look at in the century, and unemployment, it's very high. So in the pandemic year, you have been in the US. You have analyzed how various governments have responded to the crisis. What are the major differences you see on how governments have responded, more specifically to USA and India?
We would call this Akash Patal difference. It's unbelievable the ways in which people here in the United States take for granted what governments must do. So from the beginning, even under the Trump administration, there were emergency cash handouts to families, there were furlough payments, there were attempts to make sure that small businesses survive, including, small shops, restaurants, etc., were given special support. Across the board, you had support during the pandemic. And it was what we would call, handout, shocking, not, don't give, this kind of thing. Yet this was taken for granted as the right of people. And it is the right, because if a government says that we are going to stop your behavior, you're going out to earn a livelihood or you're earning a profit during the pandemic because of a lockdown, we will have to compensate you. It's only in India that there has been no such responsibility at all. Now, the other big difference is the massive scale of the fiscal response. What has been spent already in the US is in the range of $25,000 per capita. Per person, they have spent $25,000 additionally over what they would have spent. In India, I think it's barely $2 per capita. Because the government barely spent anything more last year. It supposedly gave a little bit. It didn't really give very much more for health, a tiny little bit more for states. Otherwise, it didn't, and a little bit more for food. Otherwise, it didn't really spend much more. And it cut in other directions. Whereas what I'm saying about the US, it's all additional. Now, if you are going to have that kind of variation in the 1,000 times variation, then of course the economic impact is going to be different. That's why the US economy is already reviving. Already employment is back to close to the levels of earlier. Already everybody's outlook is different. In India, you know the conditions, I don't have to tell you, but that's really because of the fact that the government response has been so niggardly, so tiny, that it has really made the problem worse rather than better.
Well, that's a scary thought to end the interview on, but thank you for your candid views, and we look forward to seeing you in India very soon.
I hope to be back very soon. Just a final point, Ajay, I'd just like to say that what's happening in India is very depressing, but it's reversible. And I do believe public pressure can reverse it. I think the farmers' movement that you have been part of has already shown that you can put pressure to at least make them stop in their tracks. And I think if there's enough public pressure, we will actually get a revival of public spending.
We hope you're right. And we really hope you're right in your last point. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And look forward to seeing you in India again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you. Thanks, Ajay.